Chapter 1. Fifth Business. Skull Mountain. Peaceable Lake. In one way, at least, our lives really are like movies. The main cast consists of your family and friends. The supporting cast is made up of neighbors, co-workers, teachers, and daily acquaintances. There are also bit players, the supermarket checkout girl with the pretty smile, the friendly bartender at the local watering hole, the guys you work out with at the gym 3 days a week. And there are thousands of extras, those people who flow through every life like water through a sieve, seen once and never again. The teenager browsing graphic novels at Barnes & Noble, the one you had to slip past, murmuring, "Excuse me," in order to get to the magazines. The woman in the next lane at a stoplight, taking a moment to freshen her lipstick. The mother wiping ice cream off her toddler's face in a roadside restaurant where you stopped for a quick bite. The vendor who sold you a bag of peanuts at a baseball game. But sometimes, a person who fits none of these categories comes into your life. This is the Joker who pops out of the deck at odd intervals over the years, often during a moment of crisis. In the movies, this sort of character is known as the fifth business, or the change agent. When he turns up in a film, you know he's there because the screenwriter put him there. But who is screenwriting our lives? Fate or coincidence? I want to believe it's the latter. I want that with all my heart and soul. When I think of Charles Jacobs, my fifth business, my change agent, my nemesis, I can't bear to believe his presence in my life had anything to do with fate. It would mean that all these terrible things, these horrors, were meant to happen. If that is so, then there is no such thing as light, and our belief in it is a foolish illusion. If that is so, we live in darkness like animals in a burrow or ants deep in their hill. And not alone. Claire gave me an army for my 6th birthday, and on a Saturday in October of 1962, I was gearing up for a major battle. I came from a big family, 4 boys, 1 girl, and as the youngest I always got lots of presents. Claire always gave the best ones. I don't know if it was because she was the eldest, because she was the only girl, or both. But of all the awesome presents she gave me over the years, that army was by far the best. There were 200 green plastic soldiers, some with rifles, some with machine guns, a dozen welded to tube-like gadgets she said were mortars. There were also 8 trucks and 12 jeeps. Perhaps the coolest thing about the army was the box it came in, a cardboard footlocker in camouflage shades of green and brown, with property of U.S. Army stenciled on the front. Below this, Claire had added her own stenciling. Jamie Morton, Commander. That was me. I saw an ad for them. "In the back of one of Terry's comic books," she said when I was done screaming with delight. "He didn't want me to cut it out because he's a booger." "That's right," Terry said. He was 8. I'm a big brother booger. He made a fork with his first 2 fingers and plugged his nostrils with them. "Stop it," our mother said. "No sibling rivalry on birthdays, please, and thank you. Terry, take your fingers out of your nose." "Anyway," Claire said, "I copied the coupon and sent it in. I was afraid it might not come in time, but it did. I'm glad you like it." And she kissed me on the temple. She always kissed me there. All these years later, I can still feel those soft kisses. "I love it," I said, holding the footlocker against my chest. "I'll love it forever." This was after breakfast, which had been blueberry pancakes and bacon, my favorite. We all got our favorite meals on our birthdays, and the presents always came after breakfast, there in the kitchen with its wood stove and long table and our hulk of a washing machine which was always breaking down. "Forever for Jamie is like 5 days, Con said. He was 10, slender, although he bulked up later, and of a scientific bent, even then. "Nice one, Conrad," our father said. He was dressed for work in a clean coverall with his name, Richard, stitched in gold thread on the left breast. Pocket. On the right breast, it said Morton Fuel Oil. "I'm impressed. Thanks, Daddy-O. Your silver tongue wins you the opportunity to help your mother clean up breakfast." "It's Andy's turn." "It was Andy's turn," Dad said, pouring syrup on the last pancake. Grab a dish towel, Silvertongue, and try not to break anything. You spoil him rotten, Con said, but he grabbed a dish towel. Connie wasn't entirely wrong about my concept of forever. 5 days later, the operation game Andy gave me was gathering dust bunnies under my bed. Some of the body parts were missing anyway. Andy got it at the Eureka Grange rummage sale for $0.25. So were the jigsaw puzzles Terry gave me. Con himself gave me a Viewmaster, and that lasted a little longer, but it eventually wound up in my closet, never to be seen again. From Mom and Dad I got clothes, because my birthday falls near the end of August, and that year I was going into 1st grade. I found new pants and shirts about as exciting as a TV test pattern, but tried to say thanks with enthusiasm. I imagine they saw through that with no trouble. False enthusiasm does not come easily to 6-year-olds. Although, sad to say, it's a skill most of us learn fairly rapidly. In any case, the clothes were washed in the Hulk, hung on the clothesline in the side yard, and finally folded away in my bureau drawers, where, it's probably needless to add, they were out of sight and mind until September came and it was time to put them on. I remember there was a sweater that was actually pretty cool. It was brown with yellow stripes. When I wore it, I pretended I was a superhero called the Human Wasp. Evildoers, beware my sting. But Con was wrong about the footlocker with the army inside. I played with those guys day in and day out, usually at the edge of the front yard where there was a dirt strip between our lawn and Methodist Road, which was itself dirt in those days. With the exception of Route 9 and the 2-lane leading to Goat Mountain, where there was a resort for rich people, all the roads in Harlow were dirt back then. I can remember my mother on several occasions weeping about all the dust that got into the house on dry summer days. Billy Paquette and Al Knowles, my 2 best friends, played army with me on many afternoons, but on the day Charles Jacobs appeared in my life for the first time, I was on my own. I don't remember why Billy and Al weren't with me, but I do remember I was happy to be by myself for a change. For one thing, there was no need to split the army into 3 divisions. For another, this was more important, I didn't have to argue with them about whose turn it was to win. In truth, it seemed unfair to me that I should ever have to lose, because they were my soldiers, and it was my footlocker. When I advanced this idea to my mother one hot late summer day shortly after my birthday, she took me by the shoulders and looked into my eyes, a sure sign that I was about to receive another lesson in life. That it's mine business is half the trouble with the world, Jamie. When you play with your friends, the soldiers belong to all of you. Even if we fight different sides, even if, when Billy and Al go home for their dinner and you pack the soldiers back into the box, it's a footlocker. Right, the footlocker. When you pack them away, they're yours again. People have many ways to be lousy to one another, as you'll find out when you're older, but I think that all bad behavior stems from plain old selfishness. Promise me you'll never be selfish, kiddo. I promised, but I still didn't like it when Billy and Al won. On that day in October of 1962, with the fate of the world dangling by a thread over a small tropical spit of land called Cuba, I was fighting both sides of the battle, which meant I was bound to come out on top. The town grader had been by earlier, on Methodist Road, moving the rocks around, my dad always grumbled, and there was plenty of loose dirt. I scraped enough together to make first a hill, then a big hill, and then a very big hill, one that came up almost to my knees. At first I thought of calling it Goat Mountain, but that seemed both unoriginal. The real Goat Mountain was only 12 miles away after all, and boring. After consideration, I decided to call it Skull Mountain. I even tried to poke a couple of eye-like caves in it with my fingers, but the dirt was dry and the holes kept caving in. Oh well, I told the plastic soldiers tumbled in their footlocker. The world is hard, and you can't have everything. This was one of my father's favorite sayings, and with 5 kids to support, I'm sure he had reason to believe it. There'll be pretend caves. I put half of my army on top of Skull Mountain, where they made a formidable crew. I especially liked the way the mortar guys looked up there. These were the Krauts. The American army I arranged at the edge of the lawn. They got all the jeeps and trucks because they would look so groovy charging up the steep slope of the mountain. Some would turn over, I was sure, but at least a few of them would make it to the top and run over the mortar guys who would scream for mercy. They wouldn't get it. To the death, I said, setting up the last few of the heroic Americans. Hitzmer, you are next. I was starting them forward, rank by rank, and making comic book-style machine gun noises when a shadow fell over the battlefield. I looked up and saw a guy standing there. He was blocking the afternoon sun, a silhouette surrounded by golden light, a human eclipse. There was stuff going on. At our house on Saturday afternoons, there always was. Andy and Con were in our long backyard, playing 3 fly 6 grounders with a bunch of their friends, shouting and laughing. Claire was up in her room with a couple of her friends, playing records on her Imperial Party Time turntable, The Locomotion, Soldier Boy, Palisades Park. There was hammering from the garage, too, as Terry and our dad worked on the old 51 Ford Dad called the Road Rocket, or the Project. Once I heard him call it a piece of shit, a phrase I treasured then and still use now. When you want to feel better, call something a piece of shit. It usually works, plenty going on, but at that moment, everything seemed to fall still. I know it's only the sort of illusion caused by a faulty memory, not to mention a suitcase loaded with dark associations, but the recollection is very strong. All of a sudden there were no kids yelling in the backyard, no records playing upstairs, no banging from the garage, not a single bird singing. Then the man bent down, and the westering sun glared over his shoulder, momentarily blinding me. I raised a hand to shield my eyes. Sorry, he said, and moved enough so I could look at him without also having to look into the sun. On top, he was wearing a black for-church jacket and a black shirt with a notched collar. On the bottom, blue jeans and scuffed loafers. It was like he wanted to be 2 different people at the same time. At the age of 6, I put adults into 3 categories: young grown-ups, and old people. This guy was a young grown-up. He had his hands on his knees so he could look at the opposing armies. "Who are you?" I asked. "Charles Jacobs." The name was vaguely familiar. He stuck out his hand. I shook it right away because even at 6, I had my manners. All of us did. Mom and Dad saw to that. "Why are you wearing that collar with the hole in it?" "Because I'm a minister. When you go to church on Sundays from now on, I'll be there. And if you go to Thursday night MYF, I'll be there too." "Mr. Latour used to be our minister," I said. "But he died." "I know. I'm sorry." "It's okay, though, because Mom said he didn't suffer, only went straight to heaven." He didn't wear a collar like that, though. Because Bill Latour was a lay preacher. That means he was sort of a volunteer. He kept the church open when there was no one else to do it. That was very good of him. "I think my dad knows about you," I said. "He's one of the deacons in the church. He gets to take up the collection. He has to take turns with the other deacons, though." "Sharing is good," Jacob said, and got down on his knees beside me. "Are you going to pray?" The idea was sort of alarming. Praying was for Church and Methodist Youth Fellowship, which my brothers and sister called Thursday Night School. When Mr. Jacobs started it up again, this would be my first year, just like it was my first year at regular school. "If you want to talk with my dad, he's in the garage with Terry. They're putting a new clutch in the Road Rocket." "Well, my dad is. Terry mostly hands him the tools and watches. He's 8. I'm 6. I think my mom might be on the back porch, watching some guys play 3 fly 6 grounders. Which we used to call Raleigh bat when I was a kid," he said, and smiled. It was a nice smile. I liked him right away. "Yeah? Uh-huh, because you had to hit the bat with the ball after you caught it. What's your name, son?" "Jamie Morton. I'm 6. "So you said." "I don't think anyone ever prayed in our front yard. I'm not going to either. What I want is a closer look at your armies. Which are the Russians and which are the Americans?" "Well, These ones on the ground are Americans, sure, but the ones on Skull Mountain are Krauts. The Americans have to take the mountain. Because it's in the way, Jacob said. Beyond Skull Mountain lies the road to Germany. That's right, and the head Kraut, Hitzmer. The author of so many evils, he said. Huh? Nothing. Do you mind if I just call the bad guys Germans? Krauts seems kind of mean. No, that's great. Krauts are Germans, and Germans are Krauts. My dad was in the war. Just the last year, though. He fixed trucks in Texas. Were you in the war, Mr. Jacobs? No, I was too young. For Korea, too. How are the Americans? Going to take that hill, General Morton? Charge it, I shouted. Shoot their machine guns! Pow! Buddha, Buddha, Buddha! Then, going down way low in my throat, Taka, Taka, Taka! A direct attack on the high ground sounds risky, General. If I were you, I'd split your troops. Like so. He moved half of the Americans to the left and half to the right. That creates a pincers movement, see? He brought his thumb and forefinger together. Drive on the objective from both sides. Maybe, I said. I liked the idea of a head-on attack, lots of bloody action, but Mr. Jacobs's idea appealed to me just the same. It was sneaky. Sneaky could be satisfying. I tried to make some caves, but the dirt's too dry. So I see. He poked a finger into Skull Mountain and watched the dirt crumble and bury the hole. He stood up and brushed the knees of his jeans. I've got a little boy who'd probably get a kick out of your soldiers in another year or two. He can play right now if he wants to. I was trying not to be selfish. Where is he? Still in Boston with his mother. There's lots of stuff to pack up. They'll be here Wednesday, I think, Thursday at the latest. But Maury's still a little young for soldiers. He'd only pick them up and throw them around. How old is he? Just 2. I bet he still pees his pants, I yelled and started laughing. It probably wasn't polite, but I couldn't help it. Kids peeing their pants was just so funny. He does at that, Jacob said, smiling, but I'm sure he'll grow out of it. Your father's in the garage, you say? Yeah. Now, I remembered where I had heard the man's name before. Mom and Dad at the supper table talking about the new minister that was coming from Boston. Isn't he awfully young? My mother had asked. Yes, and his salary will reflect that, my dad replied and grinned. They talked about him some more, I think, but I didn't pay any attention. Andy was hogging the mashed potatoes. He always did. You try that enfilading maneuver, he said, starting away. Huh? Pincers, he said, tweezing his thumb and finger together again. Oh, yeah, great. I tried it. It worked pretty good. The Krauts all died. The battle wasn't what I'd call spectacular, though, so I tried the frontal assault, with trucks and jeeps tumbling off the steep slope of Skull Mountain, plus Krauts tumbling off the back with death cries of despair. Yeah! Mom, Dad, and Mr. Jacobs sat on the front porch while the battle raged, drinking iced tea and talking about churchy things. In addition to my dad being a deacon, my mom was in the ladies' auxiliary. Not the boss of it, but the next to boss. You should have seen all the fancy hats she had in those days. There must have been a dozen. We were happy then. Mom called my brothers and sister, along with their friends, to meet the new minister. I started to come too, but Mr. Jacobs waved me back, telling Mom we'd already met. Battle on, General, he called. I battled on. Con, Andy, and their friends went out back again and played on. Claire and her friends went back upstairs and danced on, although my mother told her to turn the music down, please, and thank you. Mr. and Mrs. Morton and the Reverend Jacobs talked on, and for quite a while. I remember often being surprised at how much adults could yak. It was tiring. I lost track of them because I was fighting the Battle of Skull Mountain over again in several different ways. In the most satisfying scenario, adapted from Mr. Jacobs's pincers movement, one part of the American army kept the Germans pinned down from the front, while the rest looped around and ambushed the Germans from behind. That is this? One of them cried, just before getting shot in the head. I was starting to get tired of it and was thinking of going in for a slice of cake, if Con and Andy's friends had left any, when that shadow fell over me and my battlefield again. I looked up and saw Mr. Jacobs holding a glass of water. I borrowed this from your mother. Can I show you something? Sure. He knelt down again and poured the water all over the top of Skull Mountain. It's a thunderstorm, I shouted and made thunder noises. If you like, with lightning. Now look. He poked out 2 of his fingers like devil horns and pushed them into the wet dirt. This time the holes stayed. Presto, he said. Caves. He took 2 of the German soldiers and put them inside. They'll be tough to root out, General, but I'm sure the Americans will be up to the job. Hey, thanks. Add more water if it gets crumbly again. I will. And remember to take the glass back to the kitchen when you finish the battle. I don't want to get in trouble with your mother on my first day in Harlow, I promised, and stuck out my hand. Put her there, Mr. Jacobs. He laughed and did so, then walked off down Methodist Road toward the parsonage where he and his family would live for the next 3 years, until he got fired. I watched him go, then turned back to Skull Mountain. Before I could really get going, another shadow fell over the battlefield. This time it was my dad. He took a knee, being careful not to squash any American soldiers. Well, Jamie, what did you think of our new minister? I like him. So do I. Your mother does too. He's very young for the job, and if he's good, we'll only be his starter congregation, but I think he'll do fine, especially with MYF, Youth Calls to Youth. Look, Daddy, he showed me how to make caves. You only have to get the dirt wet so it makes kinda almost mud. I see. He ruffled my hair. You want to wash up good before supper? He picked up the glass. Want me to take this in for you? Yes, please, and thank you. He took the glass and headed back to the house. I returned to Skull Mountain, only to see that the dirt had dried out again and the caves had collapsed. The soldiers inside had been buried alive. That was okay with me. They were the bad guys, after all. These days we've become gruesomely sensitized to sex, and no parent in his or her right mind would send a 6-year-old off in the company of a new male acquaintance who was living by himself, if only for a few days. But that is exactly what my mother did the following Monday afternoon, and without a qualm. Reverend Jacobs, Mom told me I was supposed to call him that, not Mr., came walking up Methodist Hill around 2:45 and knocked on the screen door. I was in the living room coloring on the floor while Mom watched Dialing for Prizes. She had sent her name into WCSH and was hoping to win that month's grand prize, an Electrolux vacuum cleaner. She knew the chances weren't good, but, she said, hope springs infernal. That was a joke. Can you loan me your youngest for half an hour? Reverend Jacobs asked. I've got something in my garage that he might like to see. What is it? I asked, already getting up. A surprise. You can tell your mother all about it later. Mom? Of course, she said. But change out of your school clothes first, Jamie. While he does that, would you like a glass of iced tea, Reverend Jacobs? I would, he said, and I wonder if you could manage to call me Charlie. She considered this, then said, No, but I could probably manage Charles. I changed into jeans and a t-shirt, and because they were talking about adult things when I came back downstairs, I went outside to wait for the school bus. Con, Terry, and I attended the one-room school on Route 9, an easy 1/4-mile walk from our house, but Andy went to Consolidated Middle and Claire all the way across the river to Gates Falls High, where she was a freshman. Just don't be a fresh girl, Mom told her. That was also a joke. The bus dropped them off at the intersection of Route 9 and Methodist Road, at the foot of Methodist Hill. I saw them get off, and as they came trudging up the hill, squabbling. As always, I could hear them as I stood waiting by the mailbox. Reverend Jacobs came out. Ready? He asked, and took my hand. It seemed perfectly natural. Sure, I said. We met Andy and Claire halfway down the hill. Andy asked where I was going. To Reverend Jacobs's house, I said. He's going to show me a surprise. Well, don't be too long, Claire said. "It's your turn to set the table." She glanced at Jacobs, then quickly away again, as if she found him hard to look at. My big sister had a wicked crush on him before the year was out, and so did all her friends. "I'll have him back shortly," Jacobs promised. We walked down the hill hand in hand to Route 9, which led to Portland if you turned left, to Gates, Falls, Castle Rock, and Lewiston if you turned right. We stopped and looked for traffic, which was ridiculous since there were hardly any cars on Route 9 except in the summer, and then walked on past hayfields and cornfields, the stalks of the latter now dry and clattering in a mild autumn breeze. 10 minutes brought us to the parsonage, a tidy white house with black shutters. Beyond it was the First Methodist Church of Harlow, which was also ridiculous since there was no other Methodist church in Harlow. The only other house of worship in Harlow was Shiloh Church. My father considered the Shilohites moderate to serious, weirdos. They didn't ride around in horse-drawn buggies or anything, but the men and boys all wore black hats when they were outside. The women and girls wore dresses that came down to their ankles and white caps. Dad said the Shilohites claimed to know when the world was going to end. It was written down in a special book. My mother said in America, everyone was entitled to believe what they liked as long as they didn't hurt anybody. But she didn't say Dad was wrong either. Our church was larger than Shiloh, but very plain. Also, it had no steeple. It did once, but a hurricane came along back in the olden days, 1920 or so, and knocked it down. Reverend Jacobs and I walked up the parsonage's dirt driveway. I was interested to see that he had a blue Plymouth Belvedere, a very cool car. "Standard shift or push-button drive?" I asked. He looked surprised, then grinned. "Push-button," he said. "It was a wedding present from my in-laws." "Are in-laws like outlaws?" "Mine are," he said, and laughed. "Do you like cars?" "We all like cars," I said, meaning everyone in my family. Although that was less true of Mom and Claire, I guessed. Females didn't seem to totally understand the basic coolness of cars. When the road rockets fixed up, my dad's going to race it at the Castle Rock Speedway. "Really?" "Well, not him exactly. Mom said he couldn't because it's too dangerous, but some guy, maybe Dwayne Robichaud. He runs Brownie's store along with his mom and dad. He drove the 9 car at the Speedway last year, but the engine caught on fire. Dad says he's looking for another ride." "Do the Robichauds come to church?" I'll take that as a no. Come in the garage, Jamie." It was shadowy and musty smelling. I was a little afraid of the shadows and the smell, but Jacobs didn't seem to mind. He led me deeper into the gloom, then stopped and pointed. I gasped at what I saw. Jacobs gave a little chuckle, the way people do when they're proud of something. "Welcome to Peaceable Lake, Jamie." "Wow." "I got it set up while I'm waiting for Patsy and Maury to get here. I should be doing stuff in the house, and I have done a fair amount. Fixed the well pump for one thing. But there's not a whole lot more I can do until Pats gets here with the furniture. Your mom and the rest of the ladies' auxiliary did a terrific job of cleaning the place up, kiddo. Mr. Latour commuted from Orr's Island, and no one's actually lived here since before World War II. I thanked her, but I wouldn't mind if you thanked her again." "Sure, you bet," I said. But I don't believe I ever passed that second thanks on, because I barely heard what he was saying. All my attention was fixed on a table that took up almost half the garage space. On it was a rolling green landscape that put Skull Mountain to shame. I have seen many such landscapes since, mostly in the windows of toy shops, but they all had complicated electric trains running through them. There was no train on the table Reverend Jacobs had set up, which wasn't a real table at all, but sheets of plywood on a rank of sawhorses. Atop the plywood was a countryside in miniature, about 12 feet long and 5 feet wide. Power pylons, 18 inches high, marched across it on a diagonal, and it was dominated by a lake of real water that shone bright blue even in the gloom. "I'll have to take it down soon," he said, "or else I won't be able to get the car in the garage. Patsy wouldn't care for that." He bent, planted his hands above his knees, and gazed at the rolling hills, the thread-like power lines, the big lake. There were plastic sheep and cows grazing near the water. They were considerably out of scale, but I didn't notice and wouldn't have cared if I had. There were also lots of street lamps, which was a little peculiar, since there was no town and no roads for them to shine on. I bet you could have quite a battle with your soldiers here, couldn't you? Yeah, I said. I thought I could fight an entire war there. He nodded. That can't happen, though, because in Peaceable Lake, everyone gets along and no fighting is allowed. In that way, it's like heaven. Once I get MYF going, I plan to move it to the church basement. Maybe you and your brothers would help. Me, the kids would like it, I think. They sure would, I said, then added something my father said. You betch 'em, Bobcats. He laughed and clapped me on the shoulder. Now do you want to see a miracle? I guess, I said. I wasn't actually sure I did. It sounded like it might be scary. All at once I realized the two of us were alone in an old garage with no car in it, a dusty hollow that smelled as if it had been closed up for years. The door to the outside world was still open, but it seemed a mile off. I liked Reverend Jacobs okay, but I found myself wishing I had stayed home, coloring on the floor, and waiting to see if Mom could win the Electrolux and finally get the upper hand in her never-ending battle with the summer dust. Then Reverend Jacobs passed his hand slowly above Peaceable Lake, and I forgot about being nervous. There was a low humming sound from under the makeshift table, like the sound our Philco TV made when it was warming up, and all the little streetlights came on. They were bright white, almost too bright to look at, and cast a magical moony glow over the green hills and blue water. Even the plastic cows and sheep looked more realistic, possibly because they now cast shadows. Gosh, how did you do that? He grinned. Pretty good trick, huh? God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and the light was good. Only I'm not God, so I have to depend on electricity, which is wonderful stuff, Jamie. Such a gift from God that it makes us feel godlike every time we flip a switch, wouldn't you say? I guess so, I said. My grandpa Amos remembers before there were electric lights. Lots of people do, he said, but it won't be long before all those people are gone. And when that happens, nobody will think much about what a miracle electricity is, and what a mystery. We have an idea about how it works, but knowing how something works and knowing what it is are two very different things. How did you turn on the lights? I asked. He pointed to a shelf beyond the table. See that little red bulb? Uh-huh. It's a photoelectric cell. You can buy them, but I built that one myself. It projects an invisible beam. When I break it, the streetlights around Peaceable Lake go on. If I do it again, like so... He passed his hand above the landscape, and the streetlights dimmed, faded to faint cores of light, then went out. You see? Cool, I breathed. You try it. I reached my hand up. At first, nothing happened, but when I stood on tiptoe, my fingers broke the beam. The humming from beneath the table started up again, and the lights came back on. I did it! Betch 'em Bobcats, he said, and ruffled my hair. What's that humming? It sounds like our TV. Look under the table. Here, I'll turn on the overhead lights so you can see better. He flipped a switch on the wall, and a couple of dusty hanging light bulbs came on. They did nothing about the musty odor, and I could smell something else as well now, something hot and oily, but they banished some of the gloom. I bent. At my age, I didn't have to bend far, and looked beneath the table. I saw 2 or 3 boxy things strapped to the underside. They were the source of the humming sound and the oily smell, too. Batteries, he said. Which I also made myself. Electricity is my hobby, and gadgets. He grinned like a kid. I love gadgets, drives my wife crazy. My hobby's fighting the Krauts, I said. Then, remembering what he said about that being kind of mean, Germans, I mean. Everyone needs a hobby, he said, and everyone needs a miracle or two, just to prove life is more than just one long trudge from the cradle to the grave. Would you like to see another one, Jamie? Sure. There was a second table in the corner, covered with tools, snips of wire, 3 or 4 dismembered transistor radios like the ones Claire and Andy had, and regular store-bought C and D batteries. There was also a small wooden box. Jacobs took the box, dropped to one knee so we'd be on the same level, opened it, and took out a white-robed figure. Do you know who this is? I did, because the guy looked almost the same as my fluorescent nightlight. Jesus with a pack on his back. Not just any pack, a battery pack. Look. He flipped up the top of the pack on a hinge not bigger than a sewing needle. Inside, I saw what looked like a couple of shiny dimes with tiny dots of solder on them. I made these too, because you can't buy anything this small or powerful. In the stores, I believe I could patent them, and maybe someday I will, but... He shook his head. Never mind. He closed the top of the pack again and carried Jesus to the peaceable lake landscape. I hope you noticed how blue the water is, he said. Yeah, bluest lake I ever saw. He nodded. Kind of a miracle in itself, you might say. Until you take a close look. Huh? It's really just paint. I muse on that sometimes, Jamie. When I can't sleep, how a little paint can make shallow water seem deep. That seemed like a silly thing to think about, but I didn't say anything. Then he kind of snapped to and put Jesus down beside the lake. I plan to use this in MYF. It's what we call a teaching tool, but I'll give you a little preview. Okay? Okay? Here's what it says in the 14th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. Will you take instruction from God's holy word, Jamie? Sure, I guess so, I said, starting to feel uneasy again. I know you will. He said, because what we learn as children is what sticks the longest. Okay, here we go, so listen up. And straight away Jesus constrained his disciples, that means he commanded them, to get into a ship and to go before him to the other side of the water while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up into a mountain to pray. Do you pray, Jamie? Yeah, every night. Good boy. Okay, back to the story. When evening was come, he was there alone. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the 4th watch, Jesus went unto them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, It is a spirit, and they cried out for fear. But straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. That's the story, and may God bless his holy word. Good one, huh? I guess. Does spake mean he talked to them? It does, right? Right. Would you like to see Jesus walk on Peaceable Lake? Yeah, sure. He reached under Jesus' white robe, and the little figure began to move. When it reached Peaceable Lake, it didn't sink, but continued serenely on, gliding along the top of the water. It reached the other side in 20 seconds or so. There was a hill there, and it tried to go up, but I could see it was going to topple over. Reverend Jacobs grabbed it before it could. He reached under Jesus' robe again and turned him off. He did it, I said. He walked on the water. Well, he was smiling, but it wasn't a funny smile somehow. It turned down at one corner. Yes and no. What do you mean? See where he went into the water? Yeah. Reach in there. See what you find. Be careful not to touch the power lines because there's real electricity running through them. Not much, but if you brushed them, you'd get a jolt, especially if your hand was wet. I reached in, but cautiously. I didn't think he'd play a practical joke on me, as Terry and Con sometimes did, but I was in a strange place with a strange man, and I wasn't completely sure. The water looked deep, but that was an illusion created by the blue paint of the reservoir and the lights reflecting on the surface. My finger only went in up to the first knuckle. You're not quite in the right place, Reverend Jacobs said. Go a little bit to your right. Do you know your right from your left? I did. Mom had taught me, right is the hand you write with. Of course that wouldn't have worked with Claire and Con, who were what my dad called southpaws. I moved my hand and felt something in the water. It was metal, with a groove in it. "I think I found it," I told Reverend Jacobs. "I think so too. You're touching the track Jesus walks on." "It's a magic trick," I said. "I had seen magicians on the Ed Sullivan Show, and Con had a box of magic tricks he got for his birthday, although everything but the floating balls and the disappearing egg had been lost." "That's right. Like Jesus walking on the water to that ship." "Sometimes," he said, "that's what I'm afraid of." He looked so sad and distant that I felt a little scared again, but I also felt sorry for him. Not that I had any idea what he had to feel sad about when he had such a neat pretend world as Peaceable Lake in his garage. "It's a really good trick," I said, and patted his hand. He came back from wherever he'd gone and grinned at me. "You're right," he said. "I'm just missing my wife and little boy, I guess. I think that's why I borrowed you, Jamie. But I ought to return you to your mom now." When we got to Route 9, he took my hand again, even though there were no cars coming either way, and we walked like that all the way up Methodist Road. I didn't mind. I liked holding his hand. I knew he was looking out for me. Mrs. Jacobs. And Morris arrived a few days later. He was just a little squirt in Dides, but she was pretty. On Saturday, the day before Reverend Jacobs first stood in the pulpit of our church, Terry, Con, and I helped him move Peaceable Lake to the church basement where Methodist Youth Fellowship would meet every Thursday night. With the water drained, the shallowness of the lake and the grooved track running across it were very clear. Reverend Jacobs swore Terry and Con to secrecy because, he said, he didn't want the illusion spoiled for the little ones, which made me feel like a big one, a sensation I enjoyed. They agreed, and I don't think either of them peached, but the lights in the church basement were much brighter than those in the parsonage garage, and if you stood close to the landscape and peered at it, you could see that Peaceable Lake was really just a wide puddle. You could see the grooved track, too. By Christmas, everyone knew. "It's a big old fake-a-rooney," Billy Paquette said to me one Thursday afternoon. He and his brother Ronnie hated Thursday night school, but their mother made them go. "If he shows it off one more time and tells that walking on water story, I'm gonna puke." I thought of fighting him over that, but he was bigger, also my friend. Besides, he was right. Chapter 2. 3 years. Conrad's voice, a miracle. Reverend Jacobs got fired because of the sermon he gave from his pulpit on November 21st, 1965. That was easy to look up on the internet because I had a landmark to go by. It was the Sunday before Thanksgiving. He was gone from our lives a week later, and he went alone. Patsy and Morris, dubbed Tag Along Maury by the kids in MYF, were already gone by then. So was the Plymouth Belvedere with the push-button drive. My memory of the 3 years between the day when I first saw Peaceable Lake and the day of the terrible sermon are surprisingly clear, although before beginning this account, I would have told you I remembered little. After all, I would have said, how many of us remember the years between 6 and 9 in any detail? But writing is a wonderful and terrible thing. It opens deep wells of memory that were previously capped. I feel I could push aside the account. I set out to write and instead fill a book, and not a small one, about those years and that world, which is so different from the one I live in now. I remember my mother, standing at the ironing board in her slip, impossibly beautiful in the morning sunshine. I remember my saggy-seated bathing suit, an unattractive Loden green, and swimming in Harry's pond with my brothers. We used to tell each other the slimy bottom was cow shit, but it was just mud, probably just mud. I remember drowsy afternoons. In the one-room West Harlow school, sitting on winter coats in spelling corner, and trying to get poor stupid Dickie Osgood to get giraffe right. I even remember him saying, whoa, why should I have to sussu spell one when I'll never sussu see? One? I remember the webwork of dirt roads that crisscrossed our town, and playing marbles in the schoolyard during frigid April recesses, and the sound the wind made in the pines as I lay in my bed, prayers said and waiting for sleep. I remember my father coming out of the garage with a wrench in his hand and his Morton fuel oil cap pulled low on his forehead, blood oozing through the grease on his knuckles. I remember watching Ken Mackenzie introducing Popeye cartoons on the Mighty 90s show, and how I was forced to give up the TV on the afternoons when Claire and her friends arrived, because they wanted to watch American Bandstand and see what the girls were wearing. I remember sunsets as red as the blood on my father's knuckles, and how that makes me shiver now. I remember 1,000 other things, mostly good ones, but I didn't sit down at my computer to put on rose-colored glasses and wax nostalgic. Selective memory is one of the chief sins of the old, and I don't have time for it. They were not all good things. We lived in the country, and back then, country life was hard. I suppose it still is. My friend Al Knowles got his left hand, caught in his father's potato grater, and lost 3 fingers before Mr. Knowles could get the bulky, dangerous thing turned off. I was there that day, and remember how the belts turned red. I remember how Al screamed. My father, along with Terry, his faithful if clueless acolyte, got the road rocket running. God, what a gorgeous blasting clatter it made when he revved the engine. And turned it over to Dwayne Robichaud, newly painted and with the number 19 emblazoned on its side, to race at the Speedway in Castle Rock. In the first lap of the first heat, the idiot rolled it and totaled it. Dwayne walked away without a scratch. "Accelerator pedal must have stuck," he said, grinning his foolish grin. Only he said it, ass-celerator, and my father said the only ass was the one behind the wheel. "That will teach you to ever trust anything valuable to a Robichaud," my mother said, and my father stuffed his hands so deep into his pockets that the top of his underwear showed, perhaps to ensure they would not escape and go someplace. They weren't supposed to. Lenny McIntosh, the postman's son, lost an eye when he bent down to see why the cherry bomb he'd put in an empty pineapple tin didn't go off. My brother Conrad lost his voice. So, no, they weren't all good things. On the first Sunday that Reverend Jacobs took the pulpit, there were more people present than had been there in all the years fat. White-haired, good-natured Mr. Latour had kept the church open, preaching his well-meant but obscure sermons and reliably welling up at the eyes on Mother's Day, which he called Mother's Sunday. These details came courtesy of my own mother years later. I barely remembered Mr. Latour at all. Instead of 20 congregants, there were easily 4 times that number, and I remember how their voices soared during the doxology. "Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise him, ye creatures here below." It gave me goosebumps. Mrs. Jacobs was no slouch on the pedal organ either, and her blonde hair, held back with a plain black ribbon, glowed many colors in the light falling through our only stained glass window. Walking home from church on Famille, our good Sunday shoes kicking up little puffs of dust, I found myself just behind my parents, so heard Mom expressing her approval. Also, her relief. I thought, him being so young and all, we'd get a lecture on civil rights or banning the draft or something like that, she said. Instead, we got a very nice Bible-based lesson. I think people will come back, don't you? For a while, my father said. She said, "Oh, the big oil baron, the big cynic," and punched his arm playfully. As it turned out, they were both sort of right. Attendance at our church never slumped back to Mr. Latour levels, which meant as few as a dozen in winter, huddled together for warmth in the drafty, wood-stove-heated church. But it dropped slowly to 60, then 50, and finally to 40 or so, where it hovered like the barometer on a changeable summer day. No one ascribed the attrition to Mr. Jacobs's preaching, which was always clear, pleasant, and Bible-based, never anything troubling about A-bombs or freedom marches. Folks just kind of drifted away. "God isn't as important to people now," my mother said one day, after a particularly disappointing turnout. "A day will come when they'll be sorry for that." During those 3 years, Our Methodist Youth Fellowship also underwent a modest renaissance. In the Latour era, there were rarely more than a dozen of us on Thursday nights, and 4 were named Morton, Claire, Andy, Con, and Terry. In the Latour era, I was considered too young to attend, and for this, Andy sometimes used to give me head noogies and call me a lucky duck. When I asked Terry once what it was like back then, he gave a bored shrug. We sang songs and did Bible drills and promised we'd never drink intoxicating liquor or smoke cigarettes. Then he told us to love our mothers, and the Catholics are going to hell because they worship idols and Jewish people love money. He also said to imagine Jesus is listening if any of our friends tell dirty jokes. Under the new regime, however, attendance swelled to 36 kids between 6 and 17, which necessitated buying more folding chairs for the church basement. It wasn't Reverend Jacobs's mechanical Jesus toddling across Peaceable Lake. The thrill of that wore off rapidly, even for me. I doubt if the pictures of the Holy Land he put up on the walls had much to do with it either. A lot of it was his youth and enthusiasm. There were games and activities as well as sermons, because as he pointed out regularly, most of Jesus' preaching happened outside, and that meant there was more to Christianity than church. The Bible drills remained, but we did them while playing musical chairs, and quite often someone fell on the floor while searching for Deuteronomy 14 verse 9 or Timothy 2:12. It was pretty comical. Then there was the ball diamond, which Con and Andy helped him create out back. On some Thursdays, the boys played baseball and the girls cheered us on. On alternate Thursdays, it was the girls playing softball and the boys, hoping some of the girls would forget it was their turn and come in skirts, cheering them on. Reverend Jacobs' interest in electricity often played a part in his Thursday night youth talks. I remember one afternoon when he called our house and asked Andy to wear a sweater on Thursday night. When we were all assembled, he called my brother to the front of the room and said he wanted to demonstrate the burden of sin. Although I'm sure you're not much of a sinner, Andrew, he added. My brother smiled nervously and said nothing. This isn't to frighten you. Kids, he said. There are ministers who believe in that kind of thing, but I'm not one of them. It's just so you'll know. This, I've learned, is the kind of thing people say just before they try to scare the living crap out of you. He blew up a number of balloons and told us to imagine that each one weighed 20 pounds. He held the first up and said, "This one is telling lies." He rubbed it briskly on his shirt a few times and then held it against Andy's sweater, where it stuck as if it were glued there. "This one is theft." He stuck another balloon to Andy's sweater. "Here's anger." I can't remember for sure, but I think it likely he stuck 7 balloons in all to Andy's homemade reindeer sweater, one for each of the deadly sins. That adds up to over 100 pounds of sin, he said. A lot to carry, but who takes away the sins of the world? Jesus, we dutifully chorused. Right. When you ask him for forgiveness, here's what happens. He produced a pin and popped the balloons one after another, including one that had drifted free and needed to be stuck back on. I think we all felt that the balloon popping part of the lesson was quite a bit more exciting than the sanctified static electricity part. His most impressive demonstration of electricity in action involved one of his own inventions, which he called Jacob's Ladder. It was a metal box, about the size of the footlocker my toy army lived in. 2 wires that looked like TV rabbit ears jutted up from it. When he plugged it in, this invention ran on wall current rather than batteries, and flipped the switch on the side, long sparks almost too bright to look at climbed the wires. At the top, they peaked and disappeared. When he sprinkled some powder, above this device, the climbing sparks turned different colors. It made the girls ooh with delight. This also had some sort of religious point. At least in the mind of Charles Jacobs it did, but I'll be damned if I remember what it was. Something about the Divine Trinity, maybe? Once the Jacob's Ladder wasn't right there in front of us, the colored sparks rising and the current fizzing like an angry tomcat. Such exotic ideas had a tendency to fade away like a transient fever. Yet I remember one of his mini lectures very clearly. He was sitting on a chair that was turned around so he could face us over the back. His wife sat on the piano bench behind him, hands folded demurely in her lap, head slightly bowed. Maybe she was praying. Maybe she was just bored. I know that a lot of his audience was. By then, most of the Harlow Methodist youth had begun to tire of electricity and its attendant glories. Kids, science teaches us that electricity is the movement of charged atomic particles called electrons. When electrons flow, they create current, and the faster the electrons flow, the higher the voltage. That's science, and science is fine, but it's also finite. There always comes a point where knowledge runs out. What are electrons exactly? Charged atoms, the scientists say. Okay, that's fine as far as it goes, but what are atoms? He leaned forward over the back of his chair, his blue eyes, they themselves looked electric, fixed on us. No one really knows, and that's where religion comes in. Electricity is one of God's doorways to the infinite. I wish he'd bring in an electric chair and fry up some white mice, Billy Paquette sniffed one evening after the benediction. That would be interesting. In spite of the frequent and increasingly boring lectures on holy voltage, most of us looked forward to Thursday night school. When he wasn't on his hobby horse, Reverend Jacobs could give lively, sometimes funny talks with lessons drawn from Scripture. He talked about real-life problems we all faced, from bullying to the temptation to cheat answers from someone else's paper during tests we hadn't studied for. We enjoyed the games, we enjoyed most of the lessons, and we enjoyed the singing. Too, because Mrs. Jacobs was a fine pianist who never dragged the hymns. She knew more than hymns, too. On one never-to-be-forgotten night, she played a trio of Beatles songs, and we sang along with From Me to You, She Loves You, and I Want to Hold Your Hand. My mother claimed that Patsy Jacobs was 70 times better on the piano than Mr. Latour, and when the minister's young wife asked to spend some of the church collection money on a piano tuner from Portland, the deacons approved the request, unanimously. But perhaps no more Beatles songs, Mr. Kelton said. He was the deacon who had served Harlow Methodist the longest. The children can get that stuff on the radio. We'd prefer you to stick to more, Christian melodies. Mrs. Jacobs murmured her agreement, eyes demurely cast down. There was something else as well. Charles and Patsy Jacobs had sex appeal. I have mentioned that Claire and her friends were gaga for him. It wasn't long before most of the boys had crushes on her as well, because Patsy Jacobs was beautiful. Her hair was blonde, her complexion creamy, her lips full. Her slightly up-tilted eyes were green, and Connie claimed she had witchly powers because every time she happened to shift those green eyes his way, his knees turned to water. With those kind of looks, there would have been talk if she had worn more makeup than a decorous blush of lipstick, but at 23, that was all she needed. Youth was her makeup. She wore perfectly proper knee or shin-length dresses on Sundays, even though those were the years when ladies' hemlines started their climb. On MYF Thursday nights, she wore perfectly proper slacks and blouses, ship and shore, according to my mother. But the moms and grandmoms in the congregation watched her closely just the same, because the figure those perfectly proper clothes set off was the kind that made my brother's friends sometimes roll their eyes or shake a hand the way you do. After touching a stove burner someone forgot to turn off. She played softball on girls' nights, and I once overheard my brother Andy, who would have been going on 14 at the time, I think, say that watching her run the bases was a religious experience in itself. She was able to play the piano on Thursday nights and participate in most of the other MYF activities because she could bring their little boy along. He was a biddable, easy child. Everyone liked Maury. To the best of my recollection, even Billy. Paquette, that young atheist in the making, liked Maury, who hardly ever cried. Even when he fell down and skinned his knees, the worst he was liable to do was sniffle, and even that would stop if one of the bigger girls picked him up and cuddled him. When we went outside to play games, he followed the boys everywhere he could, and when he was unable to keep up with them, He followed the girls, who also minded him during Bible study or swung him around to the beat during sing time, hence the nickname Tagalong Maury. Claire was particularly fond of him, and I have a clear memory, which I know must be made up of many overlaid memories, of them in the corner where the toys were, Maury in his little chair, Claire on her knees beside him, helping him to color, or to construct a domino snake. "I want 4, just like him when I get married," Claire told my mother once. She would have been going on 17 by then, I suppose, and ready to graduate from MYF. "Good luck on that," my mother replied. "In any case, I hope yours will be better looking than Maury, Claire Bear." That was a tad unkind, but not untrue. Although Charles Jacobs was a good-looking man and Patsy Jacobs was a downright beautiful young woman, Tagalong Maury was as plain as mashed potatoes. He had a perfectly round face that reminded me of Charlie Brown's. His hair was a nondescript shade of brunette. Although his father's eyes were blue and his mother's that entrancing green, Maury's were plain old brown. Yet the girls all loved him, as if he were a starter child for the ones they would have in the following decade, and the boys treated him like a kid brother. He was our mascot. He was Tagalong Maury. One February Thursday night, my 4 siblings, and I came back from the parsonage with our cheeks red from sledding behind the church. Reverend Jacobs had set up electric lights along our run, singing "I'm Henry VIII" at the top of our lungs. I remember that Andy and Con were in a particularly hilarious mood, because they'd brought our toboggan and put Maury on a cushion at the front, where he rode fearlessly and looked like the figurehead on the prow of a ship. "You guys like those meetings, don't you?" my father asked. I think there was mild wonder in his voice. "Yeah," I said. "We did about 1,000 Bible drills tonight, then went out back on our sleds. Mrs. Jacobs, she sledded too, only she kept falling off." I laughed, and he laughed with me. "That's great, but are you learning anything, Jamie?" "Man's will should be an extension of God's will," I said, parroting that night's lesson. "Also, if you connect the positive and negative terminals of a battery with a wire, it makes a short circuit." "True," he said, "which is why you always have to be careful when you're jump-starting a car. But I don't see any Christian lesson in that. It was about how doing something wrong because you thought it might make something else better doesn't work." "Oh." He picked up the latest issue of Car and Driver, which had a cool Jaguar XKE on the cover. "Well, you know what they say, Jamie. The road to hell is paved with good intentions." He thought for a moment, then added, "and lit with electric lights." That made him laugh, and I laughed with him, even though I didn't get the joke. If it was a joke. Andy and Con were friends with the Ferguson brothers, Norm and Hal. They were what we called flatlanders, or folks from away. The Fergusons lived in Boston, so the friendship was ordinarily restricted to summer vacations. The family had a cottage on Lookout Lake, only a mile or so from our house, and the 2 sets of brothers met at another church-related event, in this case, Vacation Bible School. The Fergusons had a family membership at Goat Mountain Resort, and sometimes Con and Andy would go with them in the Ferguson station wagon to swim and have lunch in the club. The pool, they said, was about 1,000 times better than Harry's Pond. Neither Terry nor I cared much about this. The local swimming hole was fine by us, and we had our own friends, but it drove Claire wild with envy. She wanted to see how the other half lived. "They live just like us, dear," Mom said. "Whoever said the rich are different was wrong." Claire, who was running clothes through our old washing machine's wringer, scrunched her face into a pout. "I doubt that," she said. "Andy says the girls who swim in the pool wear bikinis," I said. My mother snorted. "They might as well go swimming in their bras and underpants." "I'd like to have a bikini," Claire remarked. It was, I suppose, the sort of provocation girls of 17 specialize in. My mother pointed a finger at her, soap dripping from one short-clipped nail. "That's how girls get pregnant, Missy." Claire returned that serve smartly. "Then you ought to keep Con and Andy from going. They might get a girl pregnant." Zip your lip, my mother said, cutting her eyes in my direction. Little pitchers have big ears. Like I didn't know what getting a girl pregnant meant. Sex. Boys lay down on top of girls and wiggled around until they got the feeling. When that happened, a mysterious something called jizz came from the boy's dink. It sank into the girl's belly, and 9 months later, it was time for diapers and a baby carriage. My parents didn't stop Con and Andy from going to the resort once or twice a week during the summer, in spite of my sister's dog in the manger, barking. And when the Fergusons came up for February vacation in 1965 and invited my brothers to go skiing with them, my parents sent them off to Goat Mountain without a qualm. My brothers' scarred old skis strapped to the station wagons, roof right along with the Fergusons' gleaming new ones. When they came back, there was a bright red wheal across Con's throat. "Did you drift off course and run into a tree branch?" Dad asked when he came home for supper and saw the mark. Con, a fine skier, was indignant. "Gosh, no, Dad. Me and Norm were racing. We were side by side, going like Hell's Kitchen." Mom pointed her fork at him. "Sorry, Mom, like Heck's Kitchen. Norm hit a mogul and just about lost his balance. He stuck out his arm like this," Con demonstrated, almost knocking over his glass of milk, "and his ski pole hit me in the neck. It hurt like, bad, but it's better now." Only it wasn't. The next day, the red mark had faded to a necklace, like bruise, but his voice had gotten hoarse. By that night, he could hardly speak above a whisper. 2 days later, he was completely mute. A hyperextension of the neck resulting in a stretched laryngeal nerve. That was Dr. Renault's diagnosis. He said he'd seen them before, and in a week or two, Conrad's voice would begin to come back. By the end of March, Connie would be as right as a trivet. "Nothing to worry about," he said, and there wasn't. Not for him, at least. His voice was fine. This was not true of my brother. When April rolled around, Con was still writing notes and making gestures when he wanted something. He insisted on going to school even though the other boys had started making fun of him, especially since he had solved the problem of class participation, to a degree anyway, by writing yes on one palm and no on the other. He had a pile of file cards with more communications written on them in block letters. The one his classmates found particularly hilarious was "May I use the restroom?" Con seemed to take all this in good spirits, knowing that to do otherwise would only make the teasing worse. But one night I went into the room he shared with Terry and found him lying on his bed and weeping soundlessly. I went to him, asking, "What was wrong?" A stupid question, since I knew, but you have to say something in that situation, and I could say it, because I wasn't the one who'd been struck across the throat with the ski pole of destiny. "Get out!" he mouthed. His cheeks and forehead, studded with newly arrived pimples, were flaming. His eyes were swollen. "Get out! Get out!" Then shocking me, "Get the fuck out, cocksucker!" The first gray began to appear in my mother's hair that spring. One afternoon when my father came in, looking more tired than usual, Mom told him that they had to take Con to a specialist in Portland. "We've waited long enough," she said. "That old fool, George Renault, can say whatever he likes. But I know what happened, and so do you. That careless rich boy ruptured my son's vocal cords." My father sat down heavily at the table. Neither of them noticed me in the mudroom, taking an inordinate amount of time to lace up my keds. "We can't afford it, Laura," he said. "But you could afford to buy Hiram oil in Gates Falls," she said, using an ugly, almost sneering tone of voice I had never heard before. He sat looking at the table instead of at her, although there was nothing on it except the red and white checked oilcloth. "That's why we can't afford it. We're skating on mighty thin ice. You know what kind of winter it was." We all knew, a warm one. When your family's income depends on heating oil, you keep a close eye on the thermometer between Thanksgiving and Easter, hoping the red line will stay low. My mother was at the sink, hands buried in a cloud of soap suds. Somewhere beneath, the cloud, Dishes were rattling as if she wanted to break them instead of clean them. You had to have it, didn't you? Still in that same tone of voice. I hated that voice. It was as if she was egging him on. The big oil baron. That deal was made before Khan's accident, he said, still not looking up. His hands were once more stuffed deep into his pockets. That deal was made in August. We sat together, looking at the old farmer's almanac. A cold and snowy winter, it said, coldest since the end of World War II, and we decided it was the right thing to do. You ran the numbers on your adding machine. The dishes rattled harder under the soap suds. Take out a loan! I could, but Laura, listen to me. He raised his eyes at last. I may have to do that just to make it through the summer. He's your son. I know he is, goddammit, Dad roared. It scared me, and must have scared my mother, because this time the dishes under the cloud of suds did more than rattle. They crashed, and when she raised her hands, one of them was bleeding. She held it up to him, like my silent brother showing. Yes or no in class, and said, "Look what you made me do." She caught sight of me, sitting on the woodpile and staring into the kitchen. Buzz off! Go out and play! Laura, don't take it out on Get out! She shouted. It was the way Khan would have shouted at me if he'd had a voice to shout with. God hates a snoop! She began to cry. I ran out the door, crying myself. I ran down Methodist Hill and across Route 9 without looking in either direction. I had no idea of going to the parsonage. I was too upset to even think of seeking pastoral advice. If Patsy Jacobs hadn't been in the front yard, checking to see if any of the flowers she'd planted the previous fall were coming up, I might have run until I collapsed. But she was out, and she called my name. Part of me wanted to just keep on running, but as I think I've said, I had my manners even when I was upset. So I stopped. She came to where I was standing, my head down, gasping for breath. What happened, Jamie? I didn't say anything. She put her fingers under my chin and raised my head. I saw Maury sitting on the grass beside the parsonages. Front stoop, surrounded by toy trucks. He was goggling at me. Jamie, tell me what's wrong. Just as we had been taught to be polite, we had been taught to keep our mouths shut about what went on in the family. It was the Yankee way. But her kindness undid me, and it all came pouring out. Khan's misery, the depth of which I'm convinced neither of our parents comprehended, in spite of their very real concern, my mother's fear that his vocal cords had been ruptured and he might never speak again, her insistence on a specialist, and Dad's on how they couldn't afford it. Most of all, the shouting. I didn't tell Patsy about the stranger's voice I had heard coming from my mother's mouth, but only because I could not think how to say it. When I finally ran down, she said, "Come around to the back shed. You need to talk to Charlie." Now that the Belvedere had taken its proper place in the parsonage garage, the back shed had become Jacobs's workshop. When Patsy led me in, he was tinkering with a television set that had no screen. When I put this puppy back, together, he said, slinging an arm around my shoulders and producing a handkerchief from his back pocket, I'll be able to get TV stations in Miami, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Wipe your eyes, Jamie, and your nose could use a little attention while you're at it. I looked at the eyeless TV with fascination as I cleaned up. Will you really be able to get stations in Chicago and Los Angeles? Nah, I was kidding. I'm just trying to build in a signal amplifier that will let us get something besides Channel 8. We get 6 and 13 too, I said, although 6 is a little snowstormy. You guys have a roof antenna. The Jacobs family is stuck with rabbit ears. Why don't you buy one? They sell them at Western Auto in Castle Rock. He grinned. Good idea. I'll stand up in front of the deacons at the quarterly meeting and tell them I want to spend some of the collection money on a TV antenna so Maury can watch Mighty 90 and the missus and I can watch Petticoat Junction on Tuesday nights. Never. Mind that, Jamie. Tell me what's got you in such a tizzy. I looked around for Mrs. Jacobs, hoping she'd spare me the job of having to tell everything twice, but she had quietly decamped. He took me by the shoulders and led me to a sawhorse. I was just tall enough to be able to sit on it. Is it Khan? Of course he'd guessed that. A petition for the return of Khan's voice was part of the closing prayer at every Thursday night meeting that spring, as were prayers for other MIFers who were going through hard times. Broken bones were the most common, but Bobby Underwood had suffered burns, and Carrie Doty had had to endure having her head shaved and rinsed with vinegar after her horrified mother discovered the little girl's scalp was crawling with lice. But, like his wife, Reverend Jacobs hadn't had any idea of how miserable Khan really was, or how that misery had spread through the entire family like an especially nasty germ. "Dad bought Hiram oil last summer," I said, starting to blubber. Again. I hated it. Blubbering was such a little kid's trick, but I couldn't seem to help it. He said the price was too good to turn down. Only then we had a warm winter and heating oil went down to 15 cents a gallon, and now they can't afford a specialist. And if you could have heard her, she didn't sound like Mom at all. And sometimes he puts his hands in his pockets because... But Yankee reticence finally kicked in and I finished. Because I don't know why. He produced the handkerchief again, and while I used it, he took a metal box from his workshop table. Wires sprouted from it every which way, like badly cut hair. "Behold the amplifier," he said. "Invented by yours truly. Once I get it hooked. Up, I'll run a wire out the window and up to the eave. Then I will attach that." He pointed to the corner where a rake was propped on its pole with its rusty metal tines sticking up. "The Jacobs custom antenna. Will it work?" I asked. "I don't know. I think it will. But even if it does, I believe the days of television antennas are numbered. In another 10 years, TV signals will be carried along the telephone lines, and there will be a lot more than 3 channels. By 1990 or so, the signals will be beamed down from satellites. I know it sounds like science fiction, but the technology already exists." He had his dreamy look, and I thought, he's forgotten all about Khan. Now I know that wasn't true. He was just giving me time to regain my composure and, maybe himself, time to think. People will be amazed at first, then they'll take it for granted. They'll say, "Oh yes, we have telephone TV, or we have Earth satellite TV," but they'll be wrong. It's all a gift of electricity, which is now so basic and so pervasive, we have a way of ignoring it. People like to say, "Thus and such is the elephant in the living room," meaning a thing that's too big to be ignored, but you'd even ignore an elephant if it was in the living room long enough. Except when you had to clean up the poop, I said. That made him roar with laughter, and I laughed along with him, even though my eyes were still swollen from crying. He went to the window and looked out. He clasped his hands at the small of his back and didn't speak for a long time. Then he turned to me and said, "I want you to bring Khan to the parsonage tonight. Will you do that?" "Sure," I said, without any great enthusiasm. More praying was what I thought he had in store, and I knew it couldn't hurt, but there had been a lot of praying on Khan's behalf already, and it hadn't helped either. My parents had no objections to our going to the parsonage. I had to ask them separately, because that night they were barely talking to each other. It was Connie who took convincing, probably because I wasn't very convinced myself. But because I had promised the Reverend, I didn't give up. I enlisted Claire for help instead. Her belief in the power of prayer was far greater than my own, and she had her own powers. I think they came from being the only girl. Of the 4 Morton brothers, only Andy, who was closest to her in age, could resist her when she got all pretty-eyed and asked for something. As the 3 of us crossed Route 9, our shadows long in the light of a rising full moon, Con, just 13 that year, dark-haired, slender, dressed in a faded plaid jacket handed down from Andy, held up his notepad, which he carried everywhere. He had printed while he walked, so the letters were jagged. "This is stupid." "Maybe," Claire said, "but we'll get cookies. Mrs. Jacobs always has cookies." We also got Maury, now 5, and dressed for bed in his PJs. He ran directly to Con and jumped into his arms. "Still can't talk?" Maury asked. Con shook his head. "My dad will fix you," he said. He's been working all afternoon." Then he held his arms out to my sister. Carry me, Claire Bear, and I'll give you a kiss." She took him from Con, laughing. Reverend Jacobs was in the shed, dressed in faded jeans and a sweater. There was an electric heater in the corner, the elements glowing, cherry red, but his workshop was still cold. I supposed he had been too busy tinkering away on his various projects to winterize it. The temporarily eyeless TV had been covered with a mover's quilt. Jacobs gave Claire a hug and a peck on the cheek, then shook hands with Con, who then held up his pad. More prayer. I suppose was printed on the fresh page. I thought that was a little rude, and by her frown I could see Claire felt the same, but Jacobs only smiled. "We might get to that, but I want to try something else first." He turned to me. "Whom does the Lord help, Jamie?" "Them that help themselves," I said. Ungrammatical, but true. He went to the work table and brought back what looked like either a fat cloth belt or the world's skinniest electric blanket. A cord dangled from it, going to a little white plastic box with a slide switch on top. Jacob stood with the belt in his hands, looking at Con gravely. "This is a project I've been tinkering with on and off for the last year. I call it the electrical nerve stimulator." "One of your inventions," I said. "Not exactly. The idea of using electricity to limit pain and stimulate muscles is very, very old. 60 years before the birth of Christ, a Roman doctor named Scribonius Largus discovered that foot and leg pain could be alleviated if the sufferer stepped firmly on an electric eel." "You made that up," Claire accused, laughing. Con wasn't laughing. He was staring at the cloth belt with fascination. "Not at all," Jacob said, "but mine uses small batteries, which are of my invention, for power. Electric eels are hard to come by in central Maine, and even harder to put around a boy's neck, which is what I intend to do with this homemade ENS gadget of mine. Because Dr. Renault might have been right about your vocal cords not being ruptured. Con, maybe they only need a jump start. I'm willing to make the experiment, but it's up to you. What do you say?" Con nodded. In his eyes, I saw an expression that hadn't been there in quite a while. Hope. "How come you never showed us this in MYF?" Claire asked. She sounded almost accusing. Jacobs looked surprised and a tiny bit uneasy. I suppose I couldn't. Think how it connected to a Christian lesson. Until Jamie came to see me today, I was thinking of trying it out on Al Knowles. His unfortunate accident? We all nodded. The fingers lost in the potato grater. He still feels the fingers that aren't there and says they hurt. Also, he's lost a good deal of his ability to move that hand because of nerve damage. As I said, I've known for years that electricity can help in matters like those. Now it looks like you'll be my guinea pig, Con." "So having that handy was just a lucky break?" Claire asked. I couldn't see why it mattered, but it seemed to her at least. Jacobs looked at her reproachfully and said, "Coincidence? And lucky break are words people with little faith use to describe the will of God, Claire." She flushed at that and looked down at her sneakers. Con, meanwhile, was scribbling on his pad. He held it up. "Will it hurt?" "I don't think so," Jacobs said. "The current is very low, minuscule really. I've tried it on my arm, like a blood pressure cuff, and felt no more than the tingle you get when your arm or leg has been asleep and is just beginning to wake up. If there is pain, raise your hands and I'll kill the current right away. I'm going to put this thing on. Now, it will be snug, but not tight. You'll be able to breathe just fine. The buckles are nylon. Can't use metal on a thing like this." He put the belt around Con's neck. It looked like a bulky winter scarf. Con's eyes were wide and scared, but when Jacobs asked if he was ready, he nodded. I felt Claire's fingers close over mine. They were cold. I thought Jacobs might get to the prayer then, asking for success. In a way, I suppose he did. He bent down so he could look Con directly in the eyes and said, "Expect a miracle." Con nodded. I saw the cloth around his throat rise and fall as he swallowed hard. All Right, here we go. When Reverend Jacob slid the switch on top of the control box, I heard a faint humming sound. Khan's head jerked. His mouth twitched first at one corner, then at the other. His fingers began to flutter rapidly, and his arms jerked. "Does it hurt?" Jacobs asked. His index finger was hovering over the switch, ready to turn it off. "If it hurts, hold out your hands." Khan shook his head. Then, in a voice that sounded as if it were coming through a mouthful of gravel, he said, "Doesn't hurt. Warm." Claire and I exchanged a wild glance, a thought as strong as telepathy flowing between us. Did I hear that? She was now squeezing my hand hard enough to hurt, but I didn't care. When we looked back at Jacobs, he was smiling. "Don't try to talk, not yet. I'm going to run the belt for 2 minutes by my watch, unless it starts to hurt. If that happens, hold out your hands and I'll turn it off at once." Khan didn't hold out his hands, although his fingers continued to move up and down as if he were playing an invisible piano. His upper lip lifted a few times in an involuntary snarl, and his eyes went through spasms of fluttering. Once, still in that grating, gravelly voice, he said, "I can talk again." "Hush," Jacob said sternly. His index finger hovered over the switch, ready to kill the current, his eyes on the moving second hand of his watch. After what seemed like an eternity, he pushed the switch and that faint hum died. He unloosed the buckles and pulled the belt over my brother's head. Khan's hands went immediately to his neck. The skin there was a little flushed, but I don't think that was from the electric current. It was from the pressure of the belt. "Now, Khan, I want you to say, 'My dog has fleas, they bite his knees.' But if your throat starts to hurt, stop at once." "My dog has fleas," Khan said in his strange grating voice. "They bite his knees." "Then I have to spit." "Does your throat hurt?" "No, just have to spit." Claire opened the shed door. Khan leaned out, cleared his throat, which produced an unpleasantly metallic sound like rusty hinges, and hawked a loogie that to me looked almost as big as a doorknob. He turned back to us, massaging his throat with one hand. "My dog has fleas." He still didn't sound like the Khan I remembered, but the words were clearer now and more human. Tears rose in his eyes and began to spill down his cheeks. "They bite his knees." "That's enough for now," Jacob said. "We'll go in the house, and you'll drink a glass of water. A big one. You must drink a lot of water. Tonight and tomorrow. Until your voice sounds normal again. Will you do that?" "Yes." "When you get home, you may tell your mother and father hello. Then I want you to go into your room and get down on your knees and thank God for bringing your voice back. Will you do that?" Khan nodded vehemently. He was crying harder than ever, and he wasn't alone. Claire and I were crying too, only. Reverend Jacobs was dry-eyed. I think he was too amazed to cry. Patsy was the only one not surprised. When we went into the house, she squeezed Khan's arm and said in a matter-of-fact voice, "That's a good boy." Maury hugged my brother, and my brother hugged him back hard enough to make the little boy's eyes bug out. Patsy drew a glass of water from the kitchen tap, and Khan drank all of it. When he thanked her, it was almost in his own voice. "You're very welcome, Khan. Now it's well past Maury's bedtime, and time for you kids to go home." Leading Maury to the stairs by the hand, but not turning around, she added, "I think your parents are going to be very happy." That was the understatement of the century. They were in the living room, watching the Virginian, and still not talking. Even in my joy and excitement, I could feel the freeze between them. Andy and Terry were thumping around upstairs, grousing at each other about something. Business as usual, in other words. Mom had an Afghan square in her lap and was bending over to unsnarl the yarn in her basket when Khan said, "Hello, Mom. Hello, Dad." Dad stared at him, mouth open. Mom froze, one hand in the basket and the other holding her needles. She looked up very slowly, She said, "What?" "Hello," Con said again. She screamed and flew out of her chair, kicking the knitting basket over, and grabbed him the way she sometimes had when we were little, and meant to give one of us a shaking for something we had done wrong. There was no shaking that night. She swept Con into her arms, weeping. I could hear Terry and Andy stampeding down from the second floor to see what was going on. "Say something else," she cried. "Say something else so I don't think I just dreamed it." "He's not supposed to," Claire began, but Con interrupted her, because now he could. "I love you, Mom," he said. "I love you, Dad." Dad took Con by the shoulders and looked closely at his throat, but there was now nothing to see. The red mark had faded. "Thank God," he said. "Thank God, son." Claire and I looked at each other, and once more the thought didn't need to be spoken. Reverend Jacobs deserved some thanks too. We explained about how Con was supposed to use his voice sparingly to start with, and when we told about the water, Andy went out to the kitchen and came back with Dad's oversized joke coffee cup. Printed on the side was the Canadian flag and 1 imperial gallon of caffeine, filled with water. While he drank it, Claire and I took turns recounting what had happened, with Con chipping in once or twice, telling about the tingling sensation he'd felt when the belt was turned on. Each time he interrupted, Claire scolded him for talking. "I don't believe it." Mom said this several times. She couldn't seem to take her eyes off Con. Several times she grabbed him and hugged him as if she was afraid he might sprout wings, turn into an angel, and fly away. "If the church didn't pay for his heating oil," Dad said when the tale was finished, "Reverend Jacobs would never have to pay for another gallon." "We'll think of something," Mom said distractedly. "Right now we're going to celebrate. Terry, fetch the ice cream we were saving for Claire's birthday from the freezer. It will be good for Con's throat. You and Andy put it out on the table. We'll have all of it, so use the big bowls. You don't mind, do you, Claire?" She shook her head. "This is better than a birthday party." "I have to go to the bathroom," Connie said. "All that water. Then I'm supposed to pray. Reverend said so. The rest of you stay out while I do it." He went upstairs. Andy and Terry went into the kitchen to serve out the Neapolitan, which we called Van Chalk Straw. Funny how it all comes back. My mother and father subsided into their chairs, staring at the TV without seeing it. I saw Mom grope out with one hand and saw Dad take it without looking, as if he knew it was there. That made me happy and relieved. I felt a tug on my own hand. It was Claire. She led me through the kitchen, where Andy and Terry were squabbling over the relative size of the portions, and into the mudroom. Her eyes, when she looked at me, were wide and bright. "Did you see him?" she asked. "No," demanded. "Who?" "Reverend Jacobs, stupid. Did you see him when I asked why he never showed us that electric belt in MYF? "Well, yeah. He said he'd been working on it for a year, but if that was true, he would have showed it off. He shows off everything he makes." I remembered how surprised he had looked, as if Claire had caught him out. I had on more than one occasion. Felt the same expression on my own face when I had been caught out, but, "Are you saying he was lying?" She nodded vigorously. "Yes, he was, and his wife, she knew it. Do you know what I think? I think he started right after you were there. Maybe he already had the idea. I think he has thousands of ideas for electrical inventions. They must pop around in his head like corn. But he hadn't done anything at all on this one until today." "Gee, Claire, I don't think—" She was still holding my hand, and now she gave it a hard and impatient yank, as if I were stuck in the mud and needed help to get free. "Did you see their kitchen table? There was one place still set, with nothing on the plate and nothing in the glass. He skipped his supper so he could keep working like a demon, I'd guess from the look of his hands. They were all red, and there were blisters on 2 of his fingers. He did all that for Con?" "I don't think so," she said. Her eyes never left mine. "Claire! Jamie!" Mom called. "Come for ice cream." Claire didn't even look toward the kitchen. "Of all the kids in MYF, you're the one he met first, and you're the one he likes the best." He did it for you, Jamie. He did it for you." Then she went into the kitchen, leaving me to stand by the woodpile, feeling stunned. If Claire had stayed a little longer and I'd had a chance to get over my surprise, I might have told her my own intuition. Reverend Jacobs had been as surprised as we were. He hadn't expected it to work.